All right, so today we continue our study of the years of silence, that period of about 400 years from the time that Malachi wrote the last book of the Old Testament until we begin with the life of Christ in the New Testament. And we have studied, first of all, an overview of the history, especially of the Greek Empire and how it led to the Roman Empire. And we have discussed the Apocrypha, these various 14 books or parts of books that some folks believe should be in the Old Testament, but we studied the reasons why they really should not have been included. And then we talked about the Septuagint, the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, and how that helps understand some things in the New Testament. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in particular how they were written apparently in this period of the years of silence, copies of the Old Testament scriptures, but not discovered until the 1940s, and that they increased our understanding of how the scriptures were preserved for, they're about 1,000 years older than any copies we had of the Old Testament before that. And then we talked about some other developments that benefited the gospel, the use of the Greek language and the Roman roads. And here's some pictures of those roads as they are today, and a couple of the roads, and you can see that they're not in great condition, but considering they're 2,000 years old, pretty amazing that they're still there for us to observe. And then we talked about other aspects of the Roman Empire and how they helped in the spread of the gospel. Then we talked about the temple that Solomon built, but the Babylonians destroyed. Ezra, and a record of Ezra and Haggai that was rebuilt. Herod remodeled it. We'll talk more about Herod this morning. But it was restored by the Romans in 70 AD. So this morning we want to talk specifically about the synagogues and some other things that helped affect the New Testament. Again, all this information is things that help us to understand the New Testament when we get there. Things that happened during that 400 years with a lot of changes, things that affect help us to understand the New Testament. Does anybody have any questions or comments on what we talked about before we move on to discuss the synagogues this morning? All right. So in your questions, what did you learn about the synagogues? Tell me something you learned about it. Steve, what did you learn about synagogues?
They were Jewish houses of worship.
Okay. All right, there were places of worship for the Jews. Anybody have any ideas of how they developed or where they began?
They probably began during Babylonian captivity, where the Jews would meet to have the scriptures read and to pray together. And then they were continued from that time on.
Okay. Other comments on the beginning of the synagogues? Karen?
Well, one reason was because the temple was destroyed. So after they came back, of course, they eventually rebuilt it, but they needed places to worship, and eventually the idea of the synagogue spread to even small towns.
Okay. So we have to remember that when the the Jewish people went into Babylonian captivity, the temple was destroyed. They no longer had that place of worship, and they were too far away from it anyway. So what they did was they began to meet in small groups where they were. And those groups eventually led to a more organized form of worship and study, which they called the synagogues. And this is a picture of one of the buildings in Capernaum from around the time of Christ, a little bit after. So the synagogues were they didn't offer animal sacrifices because they couldn't do that. That was for the temple, and the temple had been destroyed. But they could read the scriptures and study and discuss and encourage one another and so on. Okay? Other comments on the synagogues? Let's look at some scriptures then about the synagogues. Look at Acts 15, verse 21, please. And we'll see some things that the synagogues involved in, how this was an advantage to the early church. Acts 15, verse 21. Who'd like to read Acts 15:21 for us, please? Acts chapter 15, verse 21. Bill, Acts 15, verse 21.
You want me to read 15 through 21?
No, just chapter 15, verse 21.
Okay. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath.
Okay, so what was done in the synagogues according to that verse? What happened in the synagogues? Here.
It says the reading of Moses' scriptures was read every synagogue.
Okay. Meaning, of course, the scriptures that Moses had written. Well, that's not all that they read, but in the context, that was the part that he was especially concerned about. So every synagogue, or every Sabbath day then, in the synagogue, the Jews would read the scriptures. Okay? And when they met, any male Jew would have the privilege of speaking or teaching the people, which becomes important because as Paul and Barnabas and Silas and so on, as they traveled in their journeys and they would go to a synagogue, since they were Jews, they would be invited to teach. That would give them an opportunity. And we'll look at some examples of that later on. So they were invited to teach. Jesus taught as well in the synagogues. There was a form of discipline, apparently. Look in John chapter 12, verse 42 with me, please. John chapter 12 and verse 42. And we'll see that they exercise some discipline in the synagogues. John 12 and verse 42. Who'd like to read that for us, please? John 12, verse 42. Neil, please.
Nevertheless, many of the rulers believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing him, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue.
Okay. So from what I read, the various synagogues had older men who would serve as elders, and one of the things that they would do would be discipline. If someone that was, they believed, not living as they should, they would be removed from the synagogue. And the other passages that talk about it as well. So this is one thing that was done in the synagogues as well. In this case, of course, it was used improperly to hinder the faith in Jesus. Okay? And there was also the rulers of the synagogue. Can anybody think of a ruler of the synagogue who is mentioned in the scriptures? A ruler of the synagogue would be an example of one. Okay, how about Jairus, who wanted Jesus to heal his daughter? There's a ruler of the synagogue. Apparently, the rulers of the synagogue were responsible to organize the activities that were there, the teaching and so on. And so apparently each synagogue would have a ruler of the synagogue. But the important thing for the spread of the gospel was that this gave an opportunity to teach. So let's look at an example of that. Look at Acts chapter 18 and verse 4, and there's lots of examples of it. But look at Acts chapter 18 and verse 4, please, with me. Acts chapter 18 and verse 4. If you'd like to read Acts 18, verse 4 for us, please. Steve, please.
And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks.
All right, so here's one example, but there's many others, and you can see a number on the chart. So how is this an advantage to the spread of the gospel? How did the synagogues become a benefit to the gospel? Jared?
It was a place to preach the gospel where many people would already be assembled.
Okay. So imagine today, as we try to find people who we can teach and will listen to the spread of the gospel, imagine if there was some place where there were already dozens or more of people already assembled together, and we could just go in and they would automatically invite us to teach them. What a blessing that would be. But that's what the early church had in these synagogues. And when you read through the book of Acts, every city that they would go to in their travels, the first place they would go to teach would be the synagogues. Now, usually it wasn't but a few weeks that they would get kicked out. But in the meantime, they had made contacts, and they usually converted a number of people. And so they had a start for a new congregation in that city because they worked with the synagogues, and the fact that they were able there then to teach the gospel. Okay, so the synagogues were important in the spread of the gospel, as we have recorded in Scripture. Other comments or discussion on the synagogues or how they affected the early church? The discussion on the synagogues.
Did the Jews build those synagogues?
Okay, who built the synagogues? Well, who met in the synagogues? Go ahead. Susie?
Well, I think they had to have, there was some regulation or something about there had to be at least 10 Jewish men in order to have a synagogue in the city. So it would imply that, yes, the Jews built them.
Okay, so tradition built up about these synagogues, as you would expect among the Jews. And I've read that too, that until they had at least 10 men, then it was Jews, always Jews, because it was a Jewish synagogue. The teaching of the Old Testament was taught there and so on. But before they built a building, they had to have 10 men. If you remember in Acts 16, when Paul and Silas were in Philippi, it says they went to a place at the riverside where prayer was meant, and there was women meeting there. Apparently not enough men there to have to build a synagogue building, but there were women meeting, and they taught those women that were there. Okay, but it was Jews, yes, always Jews, because it was a Jewish place of worship. Other comments on the synagogues? Anything else on the synagogues? All right. Then I want to talk about some of the various different groups that we read about in the New Testament. Groups, again, which developed during this period of silence. We read about them in the New Testament, but where did they come from? And one of the main ones, the ones we read about the most frequently, is the Pharisees. So, well, first of all, what do you know about the Pharisees? Tell me what you've learned about the Pharisees, and then we'll make a number of specific observations I would like. But what do you know? What did you learn about the Pharisees? Tell me something you know about the Pharisees. Rick.
To me, there's still a sect of Jews that followed the Old Testament teachings over Christ.
Okay. They were a sect among the Jews, emphasized strictness. Okay. Other comments. What else did you learn about them, Susie? What did you learn about them?
They were made up of middle-class Jews. They were very strict in the observance of the Mosaic law and opposed anything that might corrupt that Jewish system of law. And many of their ideas may have originally been an outgrowth of a sincere worship to worship, a sincere desire to worship God, but over time it became formalistic, legalistic, and they stressed tradition and ceremonial rites over the law.
Okay, so we'll come back to those points that Susie has made, but a lot of times people today will refer to anybody who believes in strictly following the Bible as we're just a bunch of Pharisees, meaning that strict following the Bible or the Scriptures is Pharisaical. But we'll see that the Pharisees, it may have started out that way, but that wasn't the way it was in Jesus' time. Jesus never once objected to strict following the law, but he had a number of other objections to them, which we'll talk about maybe some more later on and enlarge on what Susie said. Anything else you know about the Pharisees from your studies? Anybody? Debbie?
Weren't a lot of them lawyers, so they would know the law completely?
Okay. It relates to the group known as the scribes, which are sometimes called lawyers. They're a different group, but they were often together. And many of the scribes or lawyers were Pharisees because of their knowledge of the law. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the scribes later on. Other comments on the Pharisees? All right. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but I've known people who would accuse people like us that you're Pharisees because you believe in following strictly the law. But the problem that Jesus had with the Pharisees, he never once criticized them for strictly following the law. That wasn't his problem with them. But let's look and see what the problems were that he did have with them. First of all, they had human rules, traditions that they'd made up besides what was in the law. Look with me in Matthew chapter 15, in a passage that hopefully we're familiar with. Matthew chapter 15. And we'll see Jesus' criticism of them there. Matthew chapter 15. And, well, we'll start with verse 1. Matthew 15, let's read 1 through 9. Matthew 15, we'd like to read verses 1 through 9 for us, please. Matthew 15, verse 1 through 9. Rick, please.
Then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." He answered and said to them, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and he who curses father and mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father and mother, 'Whatever profit you might have received from me as a gift of God,' then he need not honor his father and mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites! Well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, 'These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctors the commandments of men.'"
All right. So here you see Jesus' criticism, one of the main ones he had of the Pharisees. And what was he criticizing them for? Did he criticize them because they obeyed the law, the Old Testament? See?
He ritualized washing before eating.
Okay. So that first of all, he criticized them because they had made a human tradition into law. There's nothing wrong with washing your hands before you eat. That's not the problem. The problem was that they criticized, in this case, Jesus' disciples as though they'd done something wrong because they didn't do it. They acknowledged it was the tradition of the elders. It wasn't the scriptures. It was the fact that they were condemning people as being wrong for not doing rules they had made up. Okay? So that's one thing. They had human rules, not God's law, and they bound them on the people. Okay? What else do you see in that passage that shows what problem Jesus had with them? Anything else? Karen?
Well, they were at the same time transgressing the commandment of God, but trying to enforce their own rules.
Okay? So in making their rules, they transgress God's rules. What rule in particular does he bring up that they transgressed? Susie?
The money that they would have used to honor their father and mother, they declared that it was Corban, or it had been dedicated to God, and therefore they couldn't honor their father and mother. So they were going around the law.
Okay.
Something they really didn't want to do.
All right, so here you have a clear law of God. One of the Ten Commandments, honor your father and your mother, which required or included caring for them when they're elderly. But they made a rule that said under certain circumstances, you could excuse yourself from that because you had done some other things with your money. So he said, you have disobeyed or transgressed God's commandments. So not only were they following human commandments, but they were disobeying. So the problem that Jesus had with them was not that they were strictly obeying God's law. He never criticized them for that. He criticized them for making up their own laws and binding them, and he criticized them for releasing people from laws that God had made. Okay? What else did he criticize? There's something else at least that he criticizes them for in these passages. At least one more thing that he criticized. What was that? Rick?
He says that they honored him with their mouth, and they honored me with their lips, but their heart is far from me.
Okay. So there's another criticism he had, was that they didn't have a good attitude. They went through the outer motions and they talked a good religion, but it wasn't in their heart. It wasn't sincere from within, and we'll see some more about that as we go along. So again, all the criticisms that Jesus had of them was not because they were following God's law, but because they were not following it and making up other rules instead. Other comments on that passage? All right, let's check another passage. Look at Matthew 23, verse 16 through 22, and we'll see again where they are making technical issues about the law and not following God's law. Matthew 23. And verse 16 we'll start in Matthew 23 and verse 16, and we'll read through 22. Matthew 23, 16 through 22. Would you like to read that for us, please? Matthew 23, 16 through 22. Bill, please.
Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? And whoever swears by the altar is nothing but whoever swears by the gift that is in it. He was obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift. Therefore he who swears by the altar swears by it, and by all things on it. And he who swears by the temple swears by it, and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God, and by him who sits on it.
Okay. So in your own words, what was he criticizing the Pharisees for? That go to the beginning of the chapter, you see he's talking to the Pharisees here and the scribes. What was his criticism of them here?
Would it have been like a spiritual blindness? They were not seeing the proper use of these things.
Okay. They didn't properly use the law. What did they do? Rather than using it properly, what did they do? Well, what did these rules? Oh, Susie, go ahead.
Well, they added to it, and they made rules about things that God had not made rules about swearing by the temple and things like that.
Okay, but in this case, the rules that they made, what was the effect of those rules? Were they requiring things of people that they should not have, or were they freeing people from things they should have done? Well, they were, Karen.
Binding, additional.
Okay, they were binding things, but the binding that they made said, okay, if you make this kind of oath, you have to keep it, but if you make that kind of oath, you don't have to keep it. And what Jesus is saying is, basically, if you make an oath, you're expected to obey it. You can't make these distinctions and free yourself from keeping your oaths. So really the effect of it, they added rules, but the effect of the rules was to free people from doing things that they should have done. They could make an oath and say, oh yes, I swear by God that I'll do thus and so, but because I've sworn in a certain way, I don't have to do it. So just like with freeing them from caring for their elderly parents, they could free themselves from keeping certain kinds of oaths. So again, what Jesus criticized them for was not that they strictly obeyed the law, but that they made rules whereby they could disobey the law and do things different from the law. Okay? Other comments on it? And we'll come back to some other passages or other aspects of Matthew 23, but other comments or questions on that reading? All right, furthermore, look at Luke chapter 18, and we'll see back to their attitudes that they had and their ungodly attitudes. Luke chapter 18. And verse 9 through 14. Luke 18, 9 through 14. And here we see more about their attitude problems. Luke 18, verse 9 through 14. We'd like to read that one for us, please. Luke 18. Steve, Luke 18, verse 9 through 14.
Also he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves. They were righteous and despise others. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give thanks of all that I possess. And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted.
Okay? So, here's an example of a Pharisee as compared to a publican. And Jesus said the publican was justified rather than the Pharisee. What was his criticism of the Pharisee here? What had the Pharisee done wrong, Steve?
He was criticizing the Pharisee for thinking he was better than the tax collector.
All right. It's because he thought he was so good. And in particular, Rick?
There was no humbleness at all in the Pharisee. He was more or less bragging on himself.
Okay. To God. In prayer to God, telling God how good he is. How good he is. And notice in particular in verse 9, it says that the parable is about those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Okay? So one problem, again, was to criticize the Pharisee for keeping God's law and strictly obeying the law. That wasn't it, was it? It was their attitude that they thought that they were so good and didn't care about other people. And we see other examples of that when they criticized Jesus for associating with publicans or sinners. They thought they were too good to even be around those kind of people, even to try to teach them like Jesus was trying to save their souls. But they thought they were too good to associate with those people. And so another criticism he had, again, not that they strictly obeyed God's law, that wasn't the problem at all, but that they failed to see their own sins. They failed to realize their need for forgiveness and to acknowledge their sins and ask God to save them from their sins, and then criticize other people because they had sins and didn't see their own sins. Okay? Other comments on the attitude of the Pharisees here? All right? But they also emphasize simply outer appearance. Let's go back to Matthew 23. And we've discussed it to some extent already in Matthew 15, but let's read it in Matthew 23 again. Matthew 23, verse 23 through 28. Matthew 23, verse 23 through 28. Ralph, please.
Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithes of mint and anise and covenant, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you have done, and not to it, leave the others undone. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you may clean the outside of the cup, the platter, but within are full of extortion and excess. The blind Pharisee cleanse first that which is within the cup and the platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness.
Okay? So here's a criticism again of the scribes and the Pharisees. And what's the criticism? What does he say is the problem here? Rick?
Well, in that last verse, 28, it says, even so you also outwardly appear righteous to men. Inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness.
All right. So again, was the problem that they were strictly obeying God's law? That's not what he criticized them for. He's criticizing them for, well, in verse 28, the fact that they were concerned about how they appeared before people. They wanted the praises of people. They wanted what people thought about them. And they didn't mind, didn't care if their inner attitude was what it was. They didn't realize that your speech and your conduct must come from a proper attitude of heart. Inside they were full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. It wasn't a real concern about God or their pleasing God, like in Matthew 15 where we read that they were say good things, but it wasn't in their hearts. Same problem here. So the problem here is hypocrisy and a failure to have an inner concern about the will of God. Okay? Other comments on the passage that we read in Matthew 23. All right, when he criticized them in verse 23, he said, you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin. Now, was he criticizing them for strictly obeying the law when he said that? Susie?
No. He said these you ought to have done, but you've neglected the weightier matters.
So this,
Mercy and faith.
but this is the passage a lot of people say, see, they were strictly following the law and Jesus criticized them for that. That is not what the passage says. And I've known lots of members of the church think that's what it's saying, but that's not it. Look at the last part of 23. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. He's not criticizing them for strictly paying tithes. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that they were not doing things that were even what he called weightier matters. Justice and mercy and faith. You're leaving those things undone. So again, the problem wasn't that he wasn't criticizing them for obeying the law strictly. He was criticizing them for not obeying the law. That there were things, even important things, that are related to proper conduct according to God's law, that they were not doing right. So again, nowhere do I know of any place where he criticized anybody, Pharisees or anybody, for obeying God's law. Jesus always taught that we should obey God's teachings. The criticism was that they didn't sincerely mean it from the heart, or that they were leaving other things undone that they should have done. Okay? Other comments on that passage in Matthew 23. All right? And we're still not done. Again, the problem of improper motives. Look earlier in Matthew 23. Back up to verse 5. Matthew 23 and verse 5 through 7. We'd like to read Matthew 23, verse 5 through 7 for us, please. Chapter 23, verse 5 through 7. Neil, please.
But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their
Phylacteries.
phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at the banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues, and respectfully greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by men.
No, that's fine. Okay? So what's his criticism? Again, if you read the first part of the chapter, he's criticizing the scribes and Pharisees. What's his criticism of them in these verses?
Their appearance,
Okay?
their garments.
Okay. Steve, your comment?
They were doing everything to be seen by others.
Okay. So the problem, why he says, is all your works you do to be seen by men. What are phylacteries? Verse 5. What are phylacteries? Anybody know what a phylactery is? We don't have too many phylacteries these days. Anybody know what a phylactery is? Right, phylacteries were little containers like made out of leather, which they would copy little copies of scriptures, and they would put it in this little pocket called a phylactery around their head or maybe around their arm, and so they would carry those with them that they could study the scriptures. Well, but the scribes and Pharisees would make theirs big phylacteries, so everybody would say, "Oh, that's a religious person," not because they really cared about the scriptures, but because they cared about being seen by men. They wanted the honor of men. They loved the best places at the feast, and they wanted special seats in the synagogues, verse 6. And they wanted special greetings in the marketplace. They wanted people to honor them. And then Matthew chapter 6 talks about, again, the same kind of problem. Okay? So again, is he criticizing them for obeying God's law? That's not the criticism. criticism is because their attitude was wrong. They weren't doing it to please God. Whatever they did so that people would praise them and talk about how good they were. Okay? And then one more, verse 3 and 4 in Matthew 23. Verse 3 and 4. You'd like to read verse 3 and 4 there, Matthew 23, 3 and 4. Steve, please.
Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works. For they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers.
All right. So again, the criticism wasn't because they were obeying the law. The criticism was because they would teach others, but they didn't obey the law. They didn't do it themselves, but they would tell other people they had to do it. So the problem that Jesus had with Pharisees, if you hear somebody say, well, you people are just Pharisees, you just so important about doing what the law said. That's not the criticism that Jesus ever had. The criticism was their attitude and making their own rules, violating God's law, and just doing whatever they did to please people, not to please God. Okay? And all this group started then during this period of silence. When you get to Jesus' life, here's this group. Where did they come from? Well, they developed during this period that we're studying about. Other comments or discussion, anything else about the Pharisees that you want to talk about? Karen.
The point we made just before that about them wanting the praise of men, that's what led them to want to kill Christ, because the people were listening to Christ, they were following him, and they were jealous, and they hated him for it.
And he criticized them. He pointed out their errors, which led the people away from the scribes and Pharisees. Envy. Pilate said in Matthew 27, he knew that they were wanting to kill Jesus because of envy. Anything else about this, Nancy?
Well, we had a friend who was, when we lived up in Ohio, who was an Orthodox Jew. He happened to be my boss, and we were in his home multiple times. And we were there on a Saturday. He invited us on a Saturday once. And you see that they have the same system in place that we're reading about. On Friday before sundown, he unscrewed the light bulb in his refrigerator so he could open the door without starting a fire or a light. He had timers on everything so that he could cook and would put frozen food in the oven the night before so that it would automatically come on. So they had all these strict rules still, and they've had to rewrite them as innovations have come. So they're still making their own rules about things, but he could still do everything because there was always a way around it. If you had the timer on the oven, you didn't start that fire, it started on its own. And so it was just and he was very strict Orthodox, but you could see all of these same similarities in the little cup that they washed their hands in before they ate. It's all still there, but they've had to be creative as innovations have come in. But there's still a ruling group that tells them how to implement these same laws.
Okay, and if you talk very much to some of the Amish people around this area, it's a similar thing in many ways. They've got all their own rules that their bishop makes up of what they can do and what they can't do. Similar kind of thing. And again, the problem is not obeying God's law. The problem is human laws and improper attitudes and so on. Okay? Anything else? Okay? Well, let's move on to another one of the groups that we read about then from that developed during this period, and that's the Sadducees. And what have you learned in your studies about the Sadducees? What do you know about the Sadducees? Karen?
They developed around the time of the Pharisees, but at that point, they were in favor of adopting Greek culture instead of the Pharisees who developed because they opposed adopting Greek culture, but they did not believe in the resurrection or angels.
Okay. So again, this another group that developed during this period. They were more loose, more liberal, we would say, in their views of keeping the law. Other comments or discussion? That again, specifically, the main thing they were known for is that they did not believe in spirits, or life after death, resurrection, and so on. Other comments, Susie?
They were made up mostly of priests and aristocrats. They were wealthy, and they wanted the Jewish life to continue, but they weren't opposed to compromising to get what they wanted. And because they were made up of priests, the high priest then came from, I believe, from the Sadducees, and he held particularly great power.
Okay, so we'll talk more about them when we get to the discussion of the Sanhedrin Council. But this is more the upper class of people. And again, as has been pointed out, more liberal. They didn't believe in following the Old Testament prophets or the wisdom or literature, poetry, and so on, the Psalms, just the books of Moses. That's all they claimed to follow. But they were liberal, and as pointed out, they would compromise for political purposes with the Hellenistic, the Greek influence of culture. Okay? All right, let's look at Acts chapter 23 and verse 8, and we'll see where we're explained about their attitude towards spirits and so on. Acts 23 and verse 8. Who'd like to read Acts 23 and verse 8 for us, please? Acts 23. Bill, Acts 23, verse 8.
For Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both.
All right, so there you see a difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And the reason the Sadducees say there's no such thing as a resurrection is because they think there's no spirit. Once you die, that's the end of your existence. You don't have a spirit that continues to exist and to reunite with your body as a resurrection. Okay, so they don't believe that. The Pharisees did believe that, but the Sadducees did not. In Matthew 22, you remember Jesus proved they were wrong. You remember how he confronted them in Matthew 22 and proved, how did he prove the resurrection to these Sadducees in Matthew 22? But remember how he did that. Karen?
He went back to when God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then he said, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living.
Okay, so he went to the book of Moses. They believed in Moses, so he quoted in which God said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But those men had been dead for years. And yet Jesus said he's not the God of the dead, but of the living. So those men still existed, which disproved the Sadducees' concept that there's no life after death, and therefore no resurrection. So he disproved the concept that they held, the fundamental belief, by the scriptures that they recognized and accepted as being true. Okay, other comments on the Sadducees? Anybody has? Okay, and then some other, well, I guess I'm a little bit ahead of myself. There's some other groups that I asked you to talk about as well. What about the scribes? We've mentioned them a little bit. What do you know about the scribes? Who were the scribes? How did that group begin? Susie?
Sometimes they were referred to like lawyers. They were teachers and transcribers of the law, the sacred scriptures. Let's see. They were an independent group, but they became closely associated with the Pharisees, and so they virtually became one.
Okay. So the scribes were not a religious group as such, at least not originally. The word scribe refers to somebody who writes things, You see, it relates to Scripture. And they were people who would make copies. They didn't have, of course, Xerox machines, so they had to copy things by hand. And this was the job of scribes, to make copies of things, legal papers and so on, including especially copies of the Scripture. As such, then they became, in doing that, they would learn to know a lot about laws and the Scriptures and so on. So they were looked upon as knowledgeable as lawyers and so on. But though they were not a religious group, because they knew the law so well, they tended to associate with the Pharisees. Okay? So the scribes and Pharisees often then were mentioned together, which is why they were referred to in that way. Okay? Anything else about the scribes? All right, what was different about the high priests in the New Testament as compared to the Old? How did, in this period of the years of silence, a change occurred with regard to the high priest, and what was that? What did you learn about that? What change occurred with regard to the high priest during this period? Susie?
Well, they had to be from the tribe of Levi and descendants of Aaron, but after it became more of a political appointment rather than a adherence to God's law. And then when the Romans came in, they would choose who they wanted to be high priest.
Okay. So, exactly as Susie said, the Old Testament law, remember, we've studied the law that the descendants, the high priest always had to be a descendant of Aaron, because Aaron was the first high priest, his son after him, and so on, had to be a descendant. If you weren't a descendant of Aaron, you could not be a high priest under the old law. But it became a political appointment, especially under the Romans. They would make whoever they wanted, whoever was favorable to them as high priest. And that's why when you come to the New Testament, in particular the arrest of Jesus and so on, you sometimes read that the high priest was called Annas, and sometimes the high priest was called Caiaphas, two different men. One was the men would have been high priest according to the law, a descendant of Aaron. The other had been the one was appointed by the Romans. And so you could have two different men at the same time, that some people viewed one as high priest, some viewed another as high priest. And you have that conflict, that confusion that developed during this period between the years of silence, when the high priesthood became a political appointment rather than a spiritual appointment according to the law. Okay? Other discussion on the priesthood and the change during this period. Okay. I also asked about the rabbis. Who were the rabbis? What are the rabbis? What does that mean?
Teacher.
Okay, the word simply means teacher. At first, it was not a formal term of honor, but it became a term of honor. To call someone a teacher, like today, call somebody a teacher, that's fine. But Jesus criticized it in Matthew 23 because some people were using it as a term of honor, like father and reverend and so on. And today, of course, it's very much that kind of thing among the Jews. Okay? Brief discussion of the Sanhedrin. What do you know about the Sanhedrin Council? What did you learn about the Sanhedrin, Karen?
They were the recognized headship of the Jewish people in the days of Christ. There were 70 members, mostly priests and Sadducees, nobles, Pharisees, scribes, and elders, presided over by the high priest.
Okay, so again, here's a group that developed during this period that had a leadership role, making laws, enforcing laws. Even though there was a king and they were under Roman rule, the Romans would often let local leaders lead as long as they didn't create problems for Rome. But here it was this group that, the Acts chapter 4 and chapter 5 and chapter 6, you have people, this council arresting the apostles and creating problems for them and so on. All right, let's briefly look at the Herods so that we can finish up this material on this years of silence. So let's talk a little bit about a few of the Herods. First of all, the term Herod is a name much like Caesar. It was the name of a man, but became the name of a series of his descendants, who were all called Herods. And so you have Herod the Great, who was the one who built the temple and was a builder of many other things. He had 3 sons who, after he died, the territory was divided up among his sons, Philip, Archelaus, and Antipas. He had other sons that he murdered, wives that he murdered, and so forth. He's a nice guy. One of the sons he murdered was Aristobulus. But this son, before he was murdered, had a son named Agrippa the First, and he had a son, Agrippa the Second. Okay? So there's several things that you might want to know about these men. First of all, Agrippa the First was the one who murdered James in Acts chapter 12 and imprisoned Peter. That's this Herod, not Herod the Great, but Herod Agrippa the First. Herod Agrippa the Second was the one in Acts chapter 25 who Paul preached to and said, almost you forsake me to become a Christian. Okay? So when you read of Herod in the New Testament, you need to understand there are different men by that name. Almost all of them were wicked, but different men. Okay, I wanted us to finish that. If you have any other questions or comments on that, otherwise I'm through with the study of the years of silence. Anybody have any comments on Herod or anything else on the years of silence before we conclude? Karen?
Besides the things we've seen about the Greek language spreading during the years of silence and helping with the spread of the gospel, the building of the roads, but I think we see where all these sects that grew up in the Jewish culture, we see where the Bible says when Jesus was preaching, the people heard him gladly. They realized the great difference between what Jesus was preaching and all these sects that had developed.
Okay, and shouldn't that be the same way today? Look at all this confusion and all these man-made rules and all the problems. Look at religion today that claims to be Christian. And you see much of the very same kinds of things. And what we have to offer them is the pure gospel of Jesus Christ without human change, just what God teaches in his word. Anything else? I thank you for your participation in the studies. I appreciate it very much.